Welcome back to another lesson with me, Mr. B. In this lesson, let's take a look at how the student examples on naturalism and modernism wrapped up their essay. Did this student rephrase their thesis in accordance with the one that they wrote earlier in their introduction paragraph? So if we take a look back at their introduction, we can see that they've put a little transition right here. Stories incorporating natural forces and social conflict are more common than ever before. The lower classes, additionally, frequently talk about in the present as seen in the serialized comic The Walking Dead. So definitely this thesis sentence could use a little more clarity and synthesizing of these two ideas, but the main idea of their essay is definitely there. And the student wrote, in summary, naturalism was an international movement that inspired how people wrote about their society and the effect that it has on nature. And it kind of seems like it spills over into this next section where they start summarizing their points. It allowed for authors to examine how social issues and other environmental factors affect its inhabitants. So that's definitely what the student just talked about in the introduction, right? And it's not to say that these boxes are limiting, that this student did it incorrectly, that they didn't rephrase their thesis in box number 1 over here. But again, just like their introduction, they could have done a little better to synthesize these ideas and get their clarity across immediately. A really big piece of feedback that I have for the student is this section here and what's highlighted in red over here. Both of these sections I actually added into this student example because though they summarize their points on naturalism and how they focused on environmental factors affecting characters, the student failed to mention The Walking Dead, which was the heart of their essay. And they don't mention it in sections 3 or 4 as they move into that so what part of their conclusion and even the closing remarks where you kind of contextualize and tie the importance of naturalism and The Walking Dead in this case to emphasize those points for your reader. But when we look at the so what, the student definitely points out that naturalism is a multi-layered literary movement that creates stories of our evolution and the factors that affected it. And again, this student decides to kind of transition to that last part. What is the purpose of making these points in section number 4, where they mention that understanding American literature helps one understand American history in return. And naturalism is a stepping stone in the process. How will it affect our lives in the future? Those who want to make a better sense of American literature today must use naturalism to examine modern day societal problems. So my major feedback for this student again is that overall they definitely could have dove more into how The Walking Dead introduces ideas of classism, the negative effects of hoarding and survival instincts, to really tie it to this last point that they made at the end about naturalism being used to examine modern day societal problems. The Walking Dead is a great reflection of this section that I added here that examines the cutthroat nature of humans when left to fend for themselves and revealing that when facing life or death, humans resort to their survival instincts, which I think is a huge motif and core theme of the entire show itself. But overall, the student did do a great job at rephrasing their main ideas, summarizing their points, and emphasizing why it's important to look at naturalism and the ways that it affects not only the characters in The Walking Dead, but also as a reflection of our society. Now let's take a look at the modernism example. How did this student rephrase or paraphrase their thesis? So in section 1, this student wrote that modernism was an international and nationwide movement that inspired minorities to share their voice, which gave different perspectives and views into new, unique cultural traditions, beliefs, thoughts, and theories. Now let's take a look at what they wrote in their introduction. Many scientific ideas and technology wouldn't have been created if people didn't give new ideas a chance. A Brief History in Time from the Big Bang to Black Holes is a popular science book on cosmology created by the famous physicist Stephen Hawking, who is best known for his discovery that black holes emit radiation. His revelations have allowed scientists to begin studies on black holes and open space for the disabled community to engage in academia. So this student as well could have also synthesized their ideas a little bit better when getting to making a clear thesis statement at the end of the paragraph, but we're definitely getting these ideas here that I've highlighted that is the core of what they analyze with Stephen Hawking's A Brief History in Time and modernism's influence. And we're getting that essence in when the student talks about how inspired minorities are able to share their voice, in the case of Stephen Hawking being a brilliant mind but discriminated for his disease. And then the student goes on to summarize how modernism has allowed people to accept different types of ideas, brought to light, and allowed society to evolve in welcoming all genders, sexualities, ethnicities, and abilities. The influence of brilliant minds like Stephen Hawking created a space for those considered disabled to participate in scientific discourse. So again, the red text is something that I've added, where I think the student could have have used the same language that they wrote in the introduction to re-emphasize their points, especially since modernism is creating a space, although we know now that terms like disabled or able-bodied and many others aren't appropriate or respectful to those that represent this community or identify with this community. You're not trying to emphasize what their disability is. We want to emphasize what abilities they do have. But again, with modernism, let's think about the time that this was taking place, being from the early to mid 1900s, where we're still kind of creating a space to have this dialogue and talk about various identities being welcomed into academic discourse. Now for the big so what. Why is it important to draw connections and make American literature relevant? The student wrote, we must recognize the influence of modernism because our society wouldn't have been able to develop into the era we are today without it. Movements like Pride, Me Too, and BLM wouldn't have been created if we didn't have authors, artists, and thinkers who challenged tradition. Okay, so far, the student is definitely pointing at what modernism does as a whole, but doesn't really tie it back to the importance of what Stephen Hawking has done for, in this case, the disabled community. For their closing remarks, modernism has allowed us to develop new thoughts in so many different ways, socially, scientifically, politically, and emotionally. With new trends and ideas continually arising, it is important to find ways to accept and create spaces for new ways of thinking, even after the modernism era. So this conclusion definitely is wrapping up the importance of modernism in general. Some of my feedback for this would be that the student could definitely hone in more and draw points back to the heart of their essay, which was the analysis of Stephen Hawking's work in line with modernism as a literary movement. Although these students did receive A's for their essays, there's still a lot of room for feedback and growth to make their writing a little more concise. I hope this overview of student examples in naturalism and modernism helped. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.